The Gift, written and read by Chris Halton. A broken relationship of what was once two hearts welded together by love and affection quickly turns from warm affinity to cold, bitter recrimination when allowed to fester and slowly rot within the soul, leaving an empty shell of what one hoped held substance and future. And this became my life after my dearest love, Claire Hammond, left me forever on the platform of Euston railway station, as she waved a bitter farewell before her train departed in a fog of steam to travel to her family in Edinburgh. She was everything to me, but her cold indifference to my feelings quickly soured our relationship as she made demands upon me that I knew I could never keep. Without the necessity to dwell on these failures, she decided she could no longer be my wife and lifetime love and left to return home. It was hard for me, for without her the sunniest days were grey, and a cloud of discontent with my life hovered over me like a dark shroud of death. And this state of play affected my business and my willingness to live my life in the company of others. I therefore became a recluse, but I hasten to add, a wealthy recluse living on my own small country estate in North Essex and not far from the border with Clare in Suffolk. Of course, I was not entirely alone, as I had one housekeeper and a maid, but my contact with them was limited solely to brief instructions and paying wages and bills. Why I should feel the way that I did with Claire is quite beyond me. She had a cold, evil personality, did not care particularly for others, and was vengeful, using her natural wrath to scold and rebuke me over the most minor infraction. But although the mental attraction was superficial, I was suffocated by her beauty like an addict to morphine. With long red curls to her shoulders and a smooth, fine-boned face, a gracefully slim figure, she was everything that most men would dream of. But beauty, they say, is skin deep, and beneath this rapturous beauty lay a heart as cold as ice, and that I knew could never change. My closest friends eventually drew away from me, unwilling to listen to my constant repetition of how my life could have been with her. Even my beloved dog Zuma kept a wary distance from me. This pathetic state of affairs continued for another 2 years, until one day I received from the postman a package of no more than 6 by 4 by 2 inches. Not expecting any deliveries, I saw it was postmarked from Edinburgh, Scotland, and dated the 16th of November 1901, exactly 1 year earlier. Still, for reasons I cannot now explain, I overlooked that detail. My mind was wholly preoccupied with the thought of Claire, the unrelentingly cruel Claire for whom I was still hopelessly addicted. My heart raced as I fumbled to untie the string that bound the buff-coloured paper, and inside was a small red box that smelled of the perfume my beloved Claire used to wear. My hands were shaking, and my skin was sweating profusely. I carefully opened it to discover, wrapped in tissue paper, a gold locket on a chain inscribed, "Yours eternally." I then opened it to find a photograph of Claire and a lock of red hair. Accompanying this was a short letter signed by her, stating that she would return shortly. My heart raced with uncontrollable joy. The thought of being reunited enraptured me, and my mind censored out all that had been bad in our relationship, which I knew instinctively was wrong to ignore. My heart was sorrowful, and I yearned so deeply to be with her again. I shared my joy with my housekeeper, Mrs. Jones, for whom I had previously no more than a nodding acquaintance, and she replied, half smiling, half shocked, "My word, sir, I have never seen or experienced you to be so joyful. Will she be coming today? If so, I can prepare the spare room, and if you know for sure, I can get Lizzie, the maid, to prepare a fire." I told her I wasn't sure when she would return, but I advised her to prepare the room anyway, which she did. For the next few nights I sat with the locket lingering over what could have been, and played with the lock of her hair. which, with the smell of her perfume, brought me back to happier times when we first met. She seemed satisfied and carefree. We spent our summer days on long walks, sheltered from the summer heat under the drooping boughs of the willow trees, or rowing in the gentle ebb of the river, and the joy she brought into my life made me feel complete and at one with her. It was a week or so later that a small dog cart arrived at the house. On board was my estranged love with baggage, which the driver helped unload into the house. She stepped into the hallway, wearing a dark skirt and matching jacket, her hair neatly tied into a bun, and a fur-fringed hat perched jauntily on her blemish-free face. She stopped briefly and looked over me, smiling but retaining an air of intensity in those beautiful emerald-coloured eyes which so betook me. "Hello, my dear Ernest. You may wonder why I'm here, and especially after I ended our relationship on a sour note. But I have had time to reflect and realise what a dreadful woman I have been, and want to make amends to you." She smiled, and this time her smile radiated warmth, not the cold sarcasm of old. I was in a state of ecstatic shock, and struggled mentally with myself to take in her presence and stated intent. She looked as though she had never been away, yet her personality was different, vastly so from the beautiful harridan who walked out on me 2 years earlier. And yet I was distraught to the point that I feared this was some scheme she had hatched to wreak revenge upon me. And so I decided to extend a temporary invitation to stay in the room being prepared by Mrs. Jones and the maid. My thoughts must have lasted more than moments, because Claire said, "My dear Ernest, am I to stand in the hallway, or can we not sit down in the lounge to chat?" Getting control of my mesmerized meanderings, I snapped back to the reality of the occasion, and with a smile I bowed slightly and said, "Oh, my apologies, Claire. Please do go in." Passing her hat and jacket to the maid, she sat down in an armchair while Mrs. Jones prepared some tea and light snacks. I said, "Claire, why have you returned? You tore a hole in my wretched heart and drove me into a near life of living like a hermit." A pleasing concern swept across her finely boned face. After leaning over towards me as I sat opposite her, she gently grasped my hand and said, "While in Scotland I had, shall we say, my dear Ernest, a life-changing experience which forced me to re-evaluate who and what I am. The angry and bitter person that was once me has now departed, and I have reassessed my life in its entirety. And I deeply regret how dreadful a person I had become, but that is now firmly in the past. What you see before your eyes, my dearest, is the real me, someone who was subjugated by a distant past and reborn once more to live a life in dignity and with love for you, my darling." I briefly sat in silence, staring at her, this now gentle beauty whose eyes were moist, reflecting a broken heart she too had suffered because of what she once represented to me. Her hands gently massaged my own, and her warm skin against mine made me feel at peace with myself. But deep in my mind, I was cautioned to go slowly and to let nature play itself out, rather than to foolishly allow myself to step back into something that caused me so much pain. At that inopportune moment of reconnection, my beloved terrier Zuma strode into the room, obviously attracted by the conversation with Claire. Upon seeing her, he stopped dead in his tracks, stared at her, and started growling. But it was not her presence he was looking at. He was following something invisible to human eyesight from her face across the room and out the door. His growling grew with such an intensity that he was showing his teeth before snapping and chasing whatever he saw into the hallway and out of the house. I got up, breaking contact with her hands, and I rushed after him as he disappeared into the garden. I found him snapping and snarling at the top of the garden wall as though something had climbed up there to avoid contact with him. I personally saw nothing again and took Zuma by the collar, dragging him indoors into the kitchen where Mrs. Jones and the maid were. I instructed them both to keep Zuma in there for a few minutes to allow him to calm down and to release him back into the garden under no circumstances. I returned to Claire, who was still sitting in her chair, looking agitated and crying. I reassured her that the dog was merely overreacting to a shadow by the fireplace and was now calm, sitting in the kitchen. I then pulled her up to me with a gentle hug, then kissed her lightly on the cheek, which tasted of the salt of a tear that had rolled down her face. "Welcome back, my dear Claire, but let us tread carefully." She agreed with a sad, sullen face and went to her room to unpack and change. That night, as I lay asleep in the bedroom next to Claire, I could hear her quietly crying and apparently whispering to somebody. The words were indistinct, and briefly, as I am sure I imagined this, I thought I heard a man's voice. The thought seemed ridiculous, but her pain was real. After a few minutes, the crying grew weaker and then stopped. I presumed she had fallen back to sleep. The following morning, Claire joined me for breakfast in the dining room. She was warmly dressed in a woolen top and dress, and as with yesterday, she seemed bright and full of joy. We sat together eating, and I casually slipped into the conversation what happened last night. Not directly, but by saying, "I heard you had a bad dream last night, my dear. You seemed upset." "Really," she said, looking shocked. "What did you hear, my dear Ernest?" "Only you crying, and then you fell back to sleep." She looked satisfied and replied, "Oh, I really do not have an inkling of that. I may have had a bad dream thinking back to my loss of you." I decided not to mention what I thought was a male voice, as I then felt it was a product of my own hyper-imagination. We spent the day sitting in front of a warm fire, chatting. I asked about her life in Scotland and gently broached the life-changing moment. Of course, as fate always dictates, before she could answer, there was a caller announced to me at the door by Mrs. Jones. It was Albert Hennessy, a local farmer, a man I hadn't seen for a while due to my own self-imposed exile. I went to the hallway where he stood with a floppy felt hat in his hands. He was dressed in a heavy old-fashioned frock coat, breeches and leather boots. A man in his late 60s, his face bore the scars of an outdoorsman, having spent a lifetime exposed to the elements. He appeared agitatedly sad and said, "Begging your pardon, sir, but I've just been into the meadow by the Stour, and my 3 dairy cows are dead. Something has ripped their throats and they be bled dry." "Good God," I exclaimed, "what type of creature would do that?" He bent his head slightly and continued, "I don't rightly know, sir, but whatever it be, it must have fangs to have caused the injuries it did. And I knows you have one of them telephones and wondered whether you could call the vet or someone to tell me." I responded quickly, saying, Of course, please don't worry. I'll call Adrian Sims, the vet from Clare. I'll get him to go to the meadow where I will join you shortly." An hour later, I stood in this meadow of devastation. The 3 cows had not only their throats ripped, but there were fanged bite marks found on the underside of their bodies where they had lain. Sims, along with some farm workers, had turned the corpses to see precisely what had happened, and he was shocked. Turning to me, he said, "Well, old man, I am completely baffled. They remind me of game killed by lions when I lived in Africa, only this seems more savage." He paused briefly to look again at the bodies and remarked, "We don't have lions, or indeed any creatures in the wild that could have done this, and I am frankly stumped to offer a rational explanation." Hennessy and his farm workers stood shocked to hear of the vet's revelations, and he ordered his men to round up all the surviving grazing animals on his farm and bring them into the farmyard where they were penned and kept safe. News of this spread fast to neighbouring farms, and these farmers took preventative measures such as herding their animals into safe areas where armed workers would guard them during the night, and collaborative patrols of armed men who would go out at night in the hope of confronting this wild and dangerous creature and killing it. Little did they realize how overly simplistic their plans were, for they were not only facing a savage beast, but one who was far smarter than they could ever believe. I returned home and found Claire sitting still in the lounge and knitting in front of the fire. She looked over at me with a smile and said, "Just a moment, Ernest, I must finish this cross-stitch." Having completed this, she got up a few seconds later, gave me a warm hug, looked me straight in the eyes and said with searching eyes, "Why so serious, my dear? You went out with Mr. Hennessy, and I haven't a clue as to why. Is it something bad?" I hugged her tightly and said, "Last night some creature savaged Mr. Hennessy's 3 cows in a nearby meadow he rents from me. The local vet was appalled. He hadn't seen anything like this level of savagery since he served in Africa." She backed away from me, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. Pleadingly, she looked me straight in the face and said, "I'm sorry, my dearest, but it would be better if I left you now." I became very angry with Claire at the thought that, having stepped back into my life, she had decided to leave me again, and this time I knew without her I could not survive. I raised my voice and said as she stood crying, "Are you telling me that it was you who caused this?" She refused to answer except to say, "I must pack and leave you, or you too will end up like these poor creatures." As she turned to leave, I grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her back into the lounge and closed the door. I then pushed her onto the settee and fell to my knees in front of her, and holding both of her arms, I stared into her sobbing face and said, "Claire, you must tell me what has happened to you. We must face this together." She fell silent for a long while, then nodded. And here is the story she related to me in full. She told me that she left me because she had always feared closeness. Whenever she grew attached, an inward pressure built within her, and irritation and anger followed. This pattern, she said, had marked her entire life. Relationships begun with hope, then swiftly abandoned once that pressure became unbearable. With me, she had believed things might be different. When they were not, she fled, ashamed and frightened by what she recognized in herself, and so she left to go to an aunt living in Edinburgh. Whilst there, she met a man, a Machiavellian-looking character who introduced himself as Dr. Attila Erasmus, late of Budapest, Hungary, who had arrived in Scotland to spread his scientific theory and practice across the United Kingdom. At this point in her telling, Claire grew agitated. She admitted that much of what followed was indistinct, as though her memory had been damaged in places. Certain moments stood out with unnatural clarity, while whole weeks seemed to dissolve into nothingness. She became distressed, confessing that whenever she tried to recall the beginning of her association with Erasmus, she encountered what she described only as a blank wall behind which something dreadful lay concealed. She said Erasmus possessed an unsettling confidence and spoke to her as though he understood her nature better than she understood herself. Over time, he convinced her that her anger and volatility were not flaws of character, but symptoms of a more profound corruption that could be excised. He claimed he could make her a calm, loving, complete woman, but if she would place herself entirely in his care. At this point, Claire seemed exhausted and a little confused because she couldn't remember when or exactly where she first met this man, but she did recall that she had, and she started to become hysterical at the recollection, as there was something beyond her surface memory that left a dark scar on her psyche because of some hidden truth that was eluding her. Later the same day, she seemed particularly anxious about going to bed to sleep and begged for me to stay with her for the evening in case something, that is, some inalienable force that may manifest in her sleep. I was, in this regard, so concerned for her physical and mental well-being that I telephoned my local doctor, a reliable and forthright individual named Dr. Alex Chambers, who agreed to come in the late afternoon and prescribed to her a mild sleeping draught made from laudanum, which she elected to take just before sleep with a glass of rum. Chambers, an ex-military man, had heard of the cattle's deaths. He had in fact self-admittedly travelled to my property with a loaded sidearm, a Webley revolver which, should the opportunity arise, he would have no hesitation in using. He, like many people, remained on edge, and it was on this pretext that Claire was issued with the tincture of laudanum as a relaxant. Having finished his business, he left to return home to his surgery, a 10-minute ride on horseback away, and gave me instructions to call him any time if deemed necessary. That night I arranged for a chaise longue to be placed in her room, where I would lie under a blanket whilst Claire slept in her bed a few feet away. I too had a weapon, a loaded Colt revolver, which reassured Claire that in any event we would be safe. Fortunately, that night passed peaceably for all concerned. Whatever the creature was, it did not make its presence known, and there were no reported incidents. Claire slept without a murmur, and the laudanum treatment was used every night for a week. Again, all was quiet both inside the house and with the neighbourhood, which was now starting to relax in the belief that whatever the creature was, it might well have decided to leave the district. I did not press Claire further on the story of her absence, preferring to let her choose the right moment to unburden herself. What follows is the account Claire gave me over several evenings. I have set it down as faithfully as memory allows, though there were moments when her recollection faltered, and others when she appeared to recoil from what she knew, as if knowledge itself were a wound. She recalled that Dr. Erasmus would always receive her in the evening, and over the course of weeks he claimed he could remove the darker side of her personality and make her whole and complete, like a normal person. Dr. Erasmus was quite tall, thin, and of a dark complexion. He had a sinister, overbearing manner, accentuated by his foreign appearance. He was well dressed in a tailor-made suit, wearing a monocle that added an air of mystery and intrigue. He told her that what she called temper, cruelty, and instability were parts of the soul, he said, that could be separated, drawn out, and given their own existence. She began visiting him in the evenings, as he claimed he was too busy working as a doctor in the hospital. His rooms, she said, were always dim, with a feeling that something dark and sinister lay within. He placed her in trances, he spoke to her while she was neither asleep nor awake, and all the while he insisted she was improving. For a time she believed him. She felt calmer. The quick venomous anger that once leapt up in her seemed to recede. She wrote to me in a moment of optimism and sent the locket, believing she was becoming the woman she ought to have been. And then, she said, I began to lose time. Hours vanished. Entire days became wholes. She would find herself on the streets without knowing how she had arrived there. She would come to her senses with her gloves damp as if washed, and not remember washing them. Once she woke with a bruise on her wrist shaped like fingers, though no one had touched her, at least no one she could recall. She told me the sixth session was the last she clearly remembered. She woke not in his rooms but in the hospital, surrounded by nurses who spoke to her as one speaks to a patient returned from death. They told her she had been insensible for nearly a year. Claire said that when she first sat upright, she expected to feel restored, but instead felt vulnerable, with no trace of anger left in her personality, which she felt weakened her ability to stand up for herself. But she realized why she had been chosen. There was, I suppose, a trade-off. The creature that was Erasmus needed her cruel negativity to exist. It gave him strength and enlarged his powers. And in the process, as he agreed, it made her separately free of this anger and hatred, and on some level it made her the woman she always wanted to be. But at what cost? Erasmus had now vanished. No one at the hospital admitted to knowing him. Some said he had never been on staff. Yet Claire heard whispers from the wards, stories of a dark foreign doctor seen at odd hours, and of deaths that followed his visits as surely as winter follows autumn. None of it could be proved. None of it was recorded. It was as if the man moved through the city without leaving the usual marks that demonstrate a person exists. When Claire returned to her aunt's house, she found it furnished but deserted. Her aunt was gone. No note, no explanation, only absence. It was then, Claire said, that the true horror began. At first it was only a sensation most pronounced at dusk, the feeling of being occupied, not possessed in the melodramatic sense of sermons and hysteria, but in a way more intimate and degrading, like sharing one's skin with an unwelcome twin. She would be sitting quietly and feel for a heartbeat that her eyes were not her own, that some attention was being paid to her. Then came the nights. She would fall asleep and wake to find the air of the room changed, thick, warm, and faintly perfumed, as though another body had been present. She began to hear whispers that did not belong to dreams. Once she awoke, she was certain she had spoken aloud to someone, though she was alone, and then at last she saw it. She described waking in darkness and seeing a pale mist gathered near the foot of her bed, moving as though it breathed. It was not fog from a window, nor smoke from a fire. It seemed to unfurl from her, drawn from her lungs and skin, as vapour might be drawn from warm flesh into cold air. The mist thickened, coiled, and then before her staring eyes, condensed into shape. "A man," she whispered to me, "not a man, a thing in the form of a man, yet devoid of the facial features of a man." It spoke to her without moving lips, and what it communicated was not language but certainty. It had been placed within her, fastened to her like a parasite, and it could leave her body whenever it wished, drawn out as vapour and taken form in the air. It returned the same way, dissolving again into mist and sinking back into her as though she were not a person but a vessel. She then decided to flee Scotland and return home to me, as she felt this thing could be controlled and restrained within a loving, warm environment. But there was an inescapable consciousness that this creature could never be separated. Claire's voice broke when she told me this. She insisted again and again that she had not killed those animals, that she had never walked out into the night and done those things. Her body, she said, lay sleeping while the creature took shape elsewhere. It was not her hands that tore, not her mouth that fed. Yet she felt the aftermath like a sickness, weakness in the mornings, a thirst she could not satisfy, a shame that was not born of guilt but of violation. "I am not the murderer," she said, "but it comes from me. It uses me, and it will not stop." I was left in a moral malaise with what to do to help rid her of this parasite. I sought pastoral guidance from the church, but as much as they felt pity for Claire, they believed this was an issue of the mind, not the soul, and that she should seek medical guidance. In desperation, I turned to a recently established spiritualist group in a nearby town, whose members claimed the gift of second sight, being able to communicate with those in spirit or to receive spiritual guidance. These people were at the time vilified mainly by mainstream religious doctrine as cranks or charlatans preying on the emotionally weak. Still, I reasoned that if evil can exist and manifest itself in my dearest Claire, there must be those who represent the forces of good to challenge it. So I contacted, through a small advertisement in the local press, a Mrs. Humphreys who, when told of the circumstances surrounding Claire, agreed to visit my home purely for a consultation to establish whether she could help. I therefore arranged for her to come to my home a week or so later, without telling Claire the true nature of her visit. In fact, the excuse was that I was seeking a home help who could act as an assistant to Claire, who was clearly much weakened by the recent experiences. And for that purpose, I arranged for a cab to collect her from Clare railway station and to bring her to the house. Mrs. Humphreys spent some time chatting with Claire over tea in the lounge about life in general, and they soon struck up an accord. A doughty lady in her mid-50s, she had a strong but reassuringly forthright character that both Claire and I related to, and agreed afterwards that she would remain as a guest for a few days. On the pretext of being escorted around my modest estate, we left Claire to wander down the winding track that led from my home to the banks of the River Stour. It was here that Mrs. Humphreys changed from her jovial, open friendliness to a serious, honest assessment of Claire. "You were right to contact me because she is possessed by an evil that I have never encountered in my days of mediumship. She is, in fact, what is known as an eidolon host, carrying an entity as ancient as the early Greeks. It is an incorporeal predator that lives dormant inside a human host, allowing the victim to remain fully conscious, autonomous and innocent, unaware of its presence. When the entity hungers, it detaches from the host, manifests a physical form, kills, feeds, and then returns." I stood and stared at her, shocked. "How do you know this? I mean to say you are entirely accurate." She replied, "I picked this thing up chatting to her, and it is capable of maintaining an identity in human form, and it is also capable of absorbing negativity like water is to plants, as this creature nourishes it." A cold chill ran down my spine as I felt quite hopeless. She then added, "But there is one thing it dislikes and will force from it a reaction." "And what is that?" I inquired with nervous trepidation. "It cannot abide being near or in flowing water, and here is the river that it cannot cross or enter. The solution is that we must get Claire to come here under a pretext, and I will rid this thing once and for all." For once in a long time I felt a growing resolve and confidence in what she said. We returned to the house, and Claire was now in the kitchen helping Mrs. Jones prepare tea. I discussed with her the idea of going for a walk after tea through the fields I owned around the house. She warmly agreed and thought it a jolly idea. We went together at dusk. The sky was cloudy with a weak sun penetrating a distant haze as it slowly slipped down towards the horizon. Save for the sound of a fast-flowing river, the air remained still. There was no drama, and Claire clung to me with the hesitation of something that was about to happen, as the sound of flowing water grew louder. When we reached the water's edge, Mrs. Humphreys appeared as though from nothingness. There was no sound of her feet or the crackle of dried undergrowth, as she appeared to the side of us as we stared at the myriad movement of the river flow. "I must be honest with you both," Mrs. Humphreys said quietly, stopping short of the water. "If anyone claims certainty at a moment like this, they are either lying or already lost. I have read of rivers being used in such matters, yes, but never as a cure. Water does not destroy what it cannot understand. It merely refuses to hold it." She looked at Claire then, not with authority, but with something like pity. "If the thing bound to you can be driven into the open, this place may do it, or it may not. Ancient forces are notoriously offended by human plans." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "Do not mistake this for an ending. At best, it may sever what has been joined. At worst, it may teach the creature something new." Claire knew instinctively that here was to be a confrontation with the evil that possessed her. "This is as far as we can go," Mrs. Humphreys said. "Whatever happens next must be chosen, not forced." I turned to demand clarification, but Claire spoke before I could. "I understand now," she said softly. The air thickened. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure, a change in density, as though the space between breaths had grown crowded. The surface of the river stirred unnaturally, not with wind, but with anticipation. From Claire's mouth came a slow, shuddering exhalation. Mist spilt from her lips. It did not disperse. It gathered. The vapour coiled upon itself, thickening, shaping the form of a human body with torso, arms and legs, into a solid mass, and then a face. Erasmus's face, stripped now of all pretence. There was no physician's civility in it, no studied concern, only appetite, ancient and amused with a snarling look of expectation. "So," he said, not aloud but directly into the mind, "this is where you would end me." Mrs. Humphreys cried out, stumbling back. I reached for Claire, but she pulled away from me deliberately, irrevocably, and then stepped into the river, which to Erasmus, who now stood next to me, was like living flesh being dropped in sulphuric acid. There was no sound other than a bubbling and burning on his form, which appeared correspondingly in precisely the same part of Claire's body as she strode deeper into the brown water. The further she went, the more difficult it was for Claire, who was fumbling to regain a footing on the riverbed. But she went deeper with an icy resolve on her face to finish this. Erasmus recoiled, not in pain, but in fury. "You cannot deny me my shelter and my right to exist," he hissed. "I can," Claire said, her voice steady even as the current pulled at her skirts, "because I was never yours to take." The water rose to her waist, and Erasmus attempted to decompile again into a mist, trying to return to her. But the river rejected it, tearing at its form, scattering and reforming it endlessly. Erasmus howled, a sound without lungs, without throat, enraged not by destruction, but by separation. I waded forward, calling her name, but she shook her head. "Do not," she said. "If you love me, you would not." The water reached her chest. Her breath came shallow now, but her sad eyes never left mine. Erasmus, before my very eyes, slowly dissolved and dripped now like melting ice water onto the river bank, and thrashed seemingly in pain and screamed as she disappeared below the water, and he too was finally gone forever. Poor Claire's body was never found despite the assistance of search teams organised by the police. It was assumed the body became trapped in dark deeper water further down. Mrs. Humphreys did not remain long in the district. She returned home the following day, and it was the very last time I saw or heard from this lady. But the killings ceased, and the countryside returned to its routines. Crops grew, cattle grazed, life asserted itself with the brutal efficiency it always has. I walked the riverbanks often for a while in the hope that I would one day find my beloved's body. But as the weeks passed, the possibility and hope faded forever. Sometimes, in the early morning mists, I was sure to have seen Erasmus's evil form. But in reality, like Claire, I knew he, or the creature that pretended to be Erasmus, was gone forever. It is a story of love offered too late, of knowledge sought without wisdom, and of the terrible things we permit ourselves to believe when the alternative is loss. I loved her, and in the end that love was not enough to save her, only sufficient to damn me to remembering for the rest of my mortal days. The end.